Hello and welcome to this sculpture video where we're looking at making a sculpture out of Chavant, which is a type of oil-based clay. Now, I started this sculpture a while ago and it really started off as a sketch, but as I got into it I actually started thinking it might be worth putting a video together about it. I've covered using polymer clays in previous videos, and Sculpting is quite a well-known and popular one which I've used extensively. But Chavant is different. It's a type of oil-based clay, which means instead of being water-based like the sort of typical clay you might find in art class, instead this is an oil base. What that means is that your sculpture will never dry out, so you can continue working on it indefinitely and it will never go hard, it will never crack. The downside of that, of course, is that it's also permanently soft, so it can be damaged and misshapen if handled incorrectly. Now, there's a huge range of sculpting compounds out there. There's things like monster clay and various other types of wax, which I haven't used myself, but I have used Chavant quite a lot, and there are sort of two main types. There's the grey type of Chavant, which comes in three different hardnesses: soft, medium and hard. And the hard stuff really is hard. You almost have to heat it to be able to work it. But the stuff I'm using here is a terracotta colour, and I've seen it called a few different things, but I know it as Chavant Le Beau Touche, which I believe in French means beautiful touch, and I can sort of see why they call it that. It's a much softer clay than the grey stuff I'm used to using, and it's very, very easy to work. So I've actually found myself becoming quite a fan of it. I tend to use it for sketches, which is what this sculpture started off as. Here's a quick steampunk mask I sketched up in it, and I've also used it for this portrait here. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in a future video. But I find the clay really easy to use, so I found myself using it more and more. As I said, it started out as a sketch, but I found that I actually quite liked the sculpture, so I decided to develop it a little bit further. So I thought I'd do a short video series about it. So we're going to look at finishing off the sculpture, putting in detailing, and then my amazing fiance actually bought me a vacuum chamber for my birthday recently. Here it is here. And this is used for degassing silicon. I've spoken a little bit about this in previous videos. You can let silicon just bubble away and let the air that gets mixed into the silicon disappear in its own. But if you want to speed up the process and do it more thoroughly, you can use a vacuum chamber to pull out the air from the silicon. So I'm going to be using that to help me make a mould of this sculpture. But first things first, let's look at the sculpture itself. Now, as you may know if you've watched some of my other videos, but I'm very much into steampunk, and a common motif in steampunk is Cthulhu, or octopuses in general. I'm not quite sure where it comes from. I suppose that the idea of there being steam-powered items around means that people tend to think that octopuses are appropriate given the use of water in the technology, perhaps. I don't really know. Obviously, Lovecraft himself was, I think he was Victorian, so it's got a touch of Victoriana to the H.P. Lovecraft's universe. Anyway, Cthulhu is something that crops up quite a lot, so I thought I'd have a go at making one myself. Now, this sculpture started life as a copper armature, which you can see here, and I've soldered this together from various copper pieces, mostly plumbing parts. I deal with soldering a little bit more in a previous video, so if you're interested in that, click on the link in the bottom right hand corner there. One thing I have noticed with Chavant, and this one in particular, is you do tend to get quite oily hands using it. There's always a bit of residue when you use any type of clay. I mean, I find water-based clay really difficult to work with simply because it dries my hands out so much. But with this stuff, the clay actually does end up sticking to you as well. Again, I think just because it's so soft. So I do find it useful to wear gloves, at least when you're handling it. When you get to the later stages of the sculpture, you tend to be using tools much more than your fingers, so it's a bit easier to get away with. But in the initial stages where you're blocking out the sculpture, I do find that wearing gloves really helps. I also find that you tend to get a bit of clay stuck to your sculpting tools as you work. I suppose it's just because this is much softer than a lot of sculpting materials like Sculpting or other types of Chavant. You can get around that by simply dipping your sculpting tool in some white spirit, and that just acts as a bit of a release, I think, to stop the clay sticking to your tools. As you can see here, I've already got the basic form down, and it's sort of, I suppose you might call it hyper-real. I wouldn't call it cartoony necessarily, but I'm trying to get a sort of a stylised look to the creature here. I'm trying to keep in mind some basic sort of practicalities of physics, I suppose you might call it. So I'm trying to trace where each tentacle goes and make sure he does actually have 8 tentacles. It can be tempting just to put a mass of sort of writhing tentacles in there and not give any mind to how they might actually come together. But I think even the most stylised or sort of cartoony sculptures or even drawings, I suppose, have to have some nod to reality just to make them sort of read as being convincing pieces. I also think that no matter how sort of cartoony or sort of exaggerated your sculpture might be, I think the surface detail still needs to be quite realistic to try and ground it in some degree of reality. I find that sort of fantastical ideas sort of seem to read better and be more believable if the details of them are convincing. So although he might be an exaggerated octopoid creature, he's still got wrinkles in his skin, he's still got dimples and sort of pock marks and sort of just natural skin texture. And it just sort of helps give the sculpture sort of an air of believability. So what I'm doing here is to carve some sort of small oval shapes into the sculpture. As you can see, I'm doing these quite roughly, and what I'm doing is I'm coming in, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, you can smooth down various types of clay with white spirits, which is a type of solvent, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. So I'm cutting some quite crude sort of oval shapes in, and then I'm smoothing them down with a brush with white spirit. Also want to have some sort of dimples and indentations in the skin as well. So all I've got here is a tool with a ball end on, which just gives you a nice round hole when you press it in. So there's 2 sizes, a large one and a small one on either end. So I'm just going to hit through here and trying to add a pattern of sort of random dimples. It can be quite difficult to get things random. The human brain seems to want to put things in order too much. So it takes a bit of experimentation to get something that looks good, but yeah, just press in there. And as you can see, it is leaving a bit of a edge to the hole as well, so again I'm just going in with a paintbrush with white spirits and smoothing down the edges again. I'm also just cutting into the lines between the shapes and trying to add a little bit of a definition to the individual shapes. It can be quite annoying when you come to paint a sculpture or model where the lines between 2 different sections are a little bit aren't quite as well defined as you might like. The problem with that is if you want to paint 2 different colours, for example, you're left with the question, well, where does one colour begin and the other one finish? So I'm just trying to add a bit of definition to the sculpture here, so when I do come to paint this, it's very clear where one piece of tentacle finishes and another one starts. I also want to be able to have some skin texture into the tentacles, so what I'm doing here is just using a loop tool, which I've mentioned this before. It's just a loop of wire which is epoxied into a paintbrush handle, and what I'm doing is I'm just cutting lots of very thin channels into the tentacles here. What I'm trying to do is follow the flow of the sculpture, but to crisscross the lines. The trick is to give it not too regular a pattern, so you want to crisscross and sort of try and randomise it a little bit, but to have it sort of follow the natural flow of the sculpture. As you can see, it's bobbling up a little bit here as I cut out some channels, but again I'm going to come in here with some white spirit and smooth it out. While I was working on this, my fiance actually came in and carved a smiley face on the front of the sculpture as a bit of a joke, and I actually thought that's actually quite a nice idea. You do get creatures in nature, like I'm thinking of those Japanese, are they warrior crabs, which have the face of a samurai on their back? You do get creatures which have sort of fake faces on their carapace or on their heads or whatever it is to scare off predators. So I thought it might be quite a nice idea to sort of put some shapes into the front of the head here that aren't a face but sort of hint at the fact that they might be, if you see what I mean. So what I'm trying to do here is to sort of carve something that has that look, so it hints at being a face but it's not 100%. So here's my finished fake face, which hopefully sort of looks a little bit like it might have eyes. It does look a little bit rough in places here, I think, but I don't think it will matter too much once I've made the mould. I want to have some areas of texture which the paint can pick up on and accentuate. Right, so here's my finished sculpture. I'm quite liking the look of that. I think there's quite a nice organic sort of flow to it, and the shape sort of hints at some structure below the skin, which is sort of what you want with creatures. It just sort of adds to the believability, I think. Although this is, as I mentioned, a bit hyper real, you still want some nod to reality, I think, to sell the look of the sculpture. So that's it for the sculpture. In the next part of the video we're going to be looking at making a mould of this and casting up some copies in resin. I've noticed that a lot of sea creatures seem to have very striking colour schemes with lots of variation in colour and lots of unusual markings. So I thought it might be quite fun to use some of the masking techniques that I've used in previous painting videos to try and replicate some of these patterns. So in the next video, as well as casting up some copies of this, I'm also going to have a go at doing some interesting paint schemes to try and replicate some of the things we see in nature. Anyway, that's for the next part, so thanks for watching and I'll see you next time. Well, thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this project and others, so please do subscribe if you're interested in keeping up with what's going on. You can also find out more on my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.